We are delighted to be joined by two BSL interpreters, Graham and Eddie, and they will be interpreting throughout, and their interpreting will also be recorded, so that will be available on the video recording, and hopefully that will be of some benefit to people who might wish to make use of that facility after this evening, as well as this evening. We will be joined, as one of our speakers will be joining us remotely. That's Laura Mills, who will be joining us by Zoom. Laura's working in Pakistan at the moment, and has very kindly agreed to break her schedule in Pakistan and to join us here this evening remotely. Okay, so I'll now introduce our topic for this evening. So the topic, as you know, is the UN Convention on the Rights of Older Persons, why we need it, what should it say, and when will it happen? And we could not have a more expert panel of speakers to speak to that subject. Over the next 25 years, the proportion of the population who are older people will increase dramatically, and that, of course, will have huge policy and geopolitical implications. The UN Human Rights Council has decided to start drafting the UN Convention on the Rights of Older People. So that's a very significant development. It makes the timing of this meeting particularly suitable. So this seminar will discuss the topic from the point of view of what will happen going forwards, why we need it, when will it happen. And I think it's perhaps pertinent to say that when Ken and I first started to talk about having this sort of a meeting, the world was actually a little bit different to how it is now, in that things have, over the last few months, become a lot less certain, or a lot more uncertain than they were previously. We've had the experience of the withdrawal of a lot of international aid, and the very detrimental impact that that is having. And there's also been a greater undermining of the value-based international order of things and of international institutions. And so that's the context in which we're having the discussion. And I feel it makes having these sorts of discussions all the more important. So thank you very much for coming. Okay, so I'll move now to introduce our first speaker, Ken Bluestone, who is policy lead at Age International. Ken, I've heard you speak over a number of years now about the UN Convention on the Rights of Older People as an idea to develop persuasively and with huge expertise. And it is wonderful to see the work that you have done so consistently come to fruition, along with the work that others have done in this area. So just to expand a little bit on your background, you're the policy lead at Age International, and you focus on issues relating to older people in low and middle income countries. Your work also focuses on government relations, parliamentary work, research, building relationships with stakeholders who have a policy interest in ageing and international development, with a particular emphasis on the rights of older persons. And you have worked in policy and influencing for over 25 years, including being the chair of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Older People. Thank you, Ken. Over to you.
Wow. Thank you. And Beth, and I can't thank you and Garden Court Chambers enough for creating the space and platform. And as you said, the timing of this couldn't be more appropriate. And I'll come back to that. We all know now that this is the backdrop to the discussions we're having now are less theoretical, and they're actually much more practical about how do we take this process forward. Before I get into my presentation and explain things, I'd like to set the context of our discussion. So I'd like to ask each of you to turn to the person next to you. Just have a good old look at the person next to you. I want you to consider, as you're enjoying the beautiful view in front of you, that according to the World Health Organization, 1 out of every 2 people in the world is ageist against older people. So I'll leave it for you to decide who's who.
Exactly.
serious point that I'm trying to make here is that the backdrop, the context to this discussion that we're having of ageism, of age discrimination, of human rights abuses is against older people, something that affects all of us no matter where we are in the world, whether it's the people that we're seeing here on the screen who are receiving assistance from us, as it were, from the cyclone in Mozambique's Idai, whether it's your own experience actually that you're bringing into this room. So this is not a theoretical conversation we're having. We're going to do this. Great. So what I'm going to do briefly is I'm going to talk us through three basic things. I want us to understand and ground our understanding of why we're having a discussion about a convention. Crucially, what it's going to deliver. I mean, what is the point of this? What is the impact that it's going to have? And then a little bit of referring back to what Bethan was talking about, the process, where we are on this, what can we expect to come next? And my co-speakers are going to give you brilliant examples of actually from research, from a variety of different contexts of actually what the impact of the lack of protection of human rights looks like, but also what more can be done. So I don't have to speak to that level of granular detail. I'm just going to set the context. But I guess first, I just do want to make sure that you know who we are as Age International. So Age International exists to inspire and channel UK and international support so older people in challenging situations across the world can improve their lives. We work across a number of areas, including human rights, health, humanitarian response, and improving older people's access to income. We do this as the sister agency of Age UK, as you can see from the screen. We're also the UK member of a global network called Help Age International, which has 200 partners in 99 countries. And part of our mission is part of how we achieve our mission is through fundraising and direct support from the UK public. And this is clearly evidenced through our membership of the Disasters Emergency Committee. With regards to fundraising that we hope to do around human rights, Age International is looking to support greater participation of older people in the process of creating a convention. And we're always interested in working with others to help make that happen. So, why a convention? And I already pointed to the obvious thing here, which is that we are living through a huge seismic demographic shift in the world. And there are huge numbers of older people today, but it's going to be over 1/5 of the world's population in just a few short decades. And crucially, we tend to think about aging and older people as being a wealthy or a global north phenomenon. Well, the majority of the world's older people live in what we would call developing countries, low and middle income countries. So we have to really shift our perspective and our mindset around this. And it's important that we think and recognize and understand that you can't just use the term older people as this blanket coverall for this huge diversity of experiences. And one thing that can be obscured is the fact that actually the majority of older people are actually women. So you have to think about aging, age discrimination as something that sits alongside other forms of discrimination that people might experience, whether that's ableism, racism, sexism. The other reason why we're having this conversation and why a convention is necessary is because, frankly, the human rights system, the international human rights laws, failed older people. For example, there is no universal prohibition of discrimination on the basis of age. You don't have to listen to me explain that or trust me for that, and I'm not going to go into all the detail, but 14 years of meetings and discussions and evidence were built up at the UN in New York through the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights did a brilliant piece of work that clearly identified the gaps in legislation and law that are there, and that a convention is necessary. And there is this really useful part of the UN human rights system, the independent expert on the enjoyment of all human rights by older persons. And this office, this role, does yearly thematic and country-specific reports. And again, time and again is identified both failings of the international system as well as ways in which protection can be strengthened. But crucially, through all of this, coming back to the same conclusion that we must fix and move on with the international human rights system. So the final reason why a convention is necessary is frankly because we know it works. This is not anything new. This is how the human rights treaty body system, since its inception, has improved itself. This is why we have human rights conventions for women, for children, for persons with disabilities, because we saw that the way that the existing human rights were articulated weren't sufficient to protect, to put in place the protections for those people's rights. And that brings us to the second part, which is what a convention would deliver. And this is the real meat of it for me, which is, again, we're not having an abstract theoretical conversation here. We're doing this because this is going to have real impact on people's lives. But let's start from a legal perspective. Crucially, what a human rights convention has to deliver, and a legally binding international human rights convention has to deliver, is universality. It must go beyond national and regional legislation. So it sets a minimum set of standards, but it also creates that legal certainty, that clarity that currently isn't in place. The language that allows people like legal experts like yourselves and others to interpret the law, but also to hopefully improve the law. It provides guidance to member states. So the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was a great exemplar of how it's not about actually identifying where rights don't exist. It's about saying, how do we use the existing set of legislation that's in place and make sure that it applies and can be used effectively for the situation that these people are facing. And so the same is true for older persons. We have a whole range of existing laws and protections at an international level, which should, in theory, be protecting the rights of older persons, but it's that guidance, that clarity of how can these things be effective and made effective for older people that's missing. And this applies to both member states, to governments, as well as to non-state actors in terms of how useful that guidance is. Once we have these two pieces in place, it does something else which is really important at an international UN level, which is it establishes, it creates responsibilities. Older people throughout the decades of the UN's existence have been marginalized. And part of the reason why is because there hasn't been any language and any obligations, any responsibilities on UN agencies, on governments to put their interests front and center equally alongside others. So clarifying responsibilities of member states, of the UN bodies, we have UN Women, we have UNICEF. We don't need a new UN body to protect the rights of older persons, but what we do need is for all those UN agencies to know that they must act. They have a duty and a responsibility to take into account the rights of older persons. And so that enhancing the visibility of older people's rights within the UN system is absolutely essential. And then when we have all these things, it comes back to us then as citizens. So how do we use this tool? Because look, a convention is a piece of paper, a treaty is a set of words that we're going to articulate, and hopefully we'll get all the governments, most of the governments in the world, to sign up to this. But that we know from practice isn't enough. So it's about how we use this to work with our governments, how we use this to achieve better policies and to improve legislation. And then the final area is probably the hardest to achieve, but I would suggest perhaps the most impactful, because what we can see has been so powerful with CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is that process of recognizing persons with disabilities as rights holders, as equal in society, has changed our perspective about people with disabilities. We are being told by people with that lived experience that we must think differently about them. And we need to achieve exactly the same thing for older persons, because that ageism that I started with is endemic, and we all carry it with us. We all think, whether it's about ourselves and thinking, oh, well, you know, I've had a quote unquote senior moment, or we speak differently to somebody simply because of their age. None of that is acceptable. And part of the challenge that we have is making sure that we ourselves understand that we are rights holders actually at any age. So, process. And as Beth said, huge celebration. Earlier this month, it was this landmark decision at the Human Rights Council. There was agreement by consensus. So this means that there wasn't a single member state that was a member of the Human Rights Council that objected, that called for a vote that said, we don't think this should happen. There were grumbles, but there was a full consensus. And this is a hugely important symbolic gesture. One of the things that they agreed, so when they agreed to set up this working group to draft a convention, a legally binding instrument, they said, okay, the group will meet twice a year for 5 days at a time. But they also said, let's not get bogged down in the details now. We're going to have a meeting later on to work out the details of that. Now, this is where we come to the third bullet point here, because we are on the road where there is a decision. It is clear member states are not going to go back from that, but it's not going to be a smooth road from here. There's going to be lots of bumps and hopefully no detours, but definitely some potholes. And one of them is the fact that the UN, we talked about this challenging context in which we're living. Well, the other thing I wanted to say about, in reflection about that decision by consensus is that even though it feels like multilateralism is falling apart sometimes, and the way that governments are interacting with each other, that decision by consensus shows actually there is a true commitment still within the UN for having these types of discussions and for protecting human rights. And that's something that we have to grasp hold of. So it is a difficult situation. I'm not going to pretend that it isn't, and there is going to be a lot of tensions and arguments and differences of views. But one of the bumps that we can see ahead is going to be where the money comes from. So the decision meant that the UN has to set aside funds, and a budget was put aside, but there's another committee that makes decisions about how much money actually gets allocated to this. And then, unfortunately, even if you've got the money in the budget, it doesn't mean you've got the cash in hand. So we'll get there, but it's not going to be easy. 2 more slides, and then I'm going to pass over to my colleagues. So where next for the UK? The starting point for this is acknowledging that the UK government has played an extremely constructive role in the process throughout its history of the UN Working Group and also at the Human Rights Council, and that should be acknowledged and supported. That being said, maybe it can go a little bit further, because the UK government's position on a convention has always been basically on the fence. So it's used very careful diplomatic language to say it supports in principle. Now, it's done a huge amount with that diplomatic language, and we applaud the government for what it's done. But now it needs to shift gears, and it has to come out and fully support the convention, because the process of creating a convention is a different one. It's about bringing the experience that we have as the UK, from all of our diversity in the UK, as well as those of people in different parts of the world, to that process to make sure we get the best possible convention. So the full involvement of older people, civil society, human rights, and legal experts is necessary. And I want to leave you then with this kind of forward-thinking look on where we go next with this, which is this is not as just about the paper, as I said, this is about the process. So the paper is only going to be as useful as the effort we put into both creating it, but also how it gets used. And for this, we need as much hands on deck as possible. So this is about supporting the call that we've put out for government to make history by championing convention. And here's a photo of us handing in 30,000 signatures to the government of the public support for the government's championing the convention. It's about anyone who has expertise, both from a lived experience as well as a legal expert contributing that and being a part of the process. And it's about making sure that older people are central to this process, because again, we can't have is a process that talks about older people. What we need is a UN convention that is built on the lived experience of older people. And if anybody here is a member of a non-governmental organization, then you can join us as well in our global movement, which is the Global Alliance for the Rights of Older People, which now has over 400 members in pretty much every part of the world. And Age International is proud to be a founding member of this, but others here in the room were part of that process as well. So I leave you with that thought. Let's join the movement. We need to make sure that this convention comes into being, but it comes into being with all of our experience. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce our next speaker now, who is Bridget Sleap, who is a senior researcher at Human Rights Watch. And some background about Bridget. You're a senior researcher at Human Rights Watch and on the rights of older people. Previously, you were senior rights policy advisor at Help Age International, where you led the organization's research and advocacy on the rights of older people at the UN and national levels, including on ageism and age discrimination, autonomy and independence, and the rights of older people in responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And you've also previously worked as a research manager at the University of Bath and on HIV and AIDS related projects at International Family Health and the Panos Institute. And this evening, Bridget is going to speak to us about the practical impact that a convention could have for the older population generally, internationally, drawing on Human Rights Watch research. Thank you very much, Bridget.
Well, hello everybody, and thank you, Becca, very much for inviting me and Ken too to have this opportunity to be with you all today. And I also wanted to share my absolute delight at the Human Rights Council's resolution to start drafting a new international convention. It has taken a very long time for us to get there. And as Ken says, we have a lot more work to do, but it's certainly something that we should be celebrating at this point in time. As Bethan said, I work for Human Rights Watch, which is a global organization working in over 100 countries. What we do is we investigate human rights abuses, we expose them, and then we advocate for change. And so what I'm going to talk about now is some of the abuses that we have found in our work on older people's rights and what there needs to be in a new convention in order to make a practical difference in older people's lives. I'm going to look at the rights to non-discrimination, to live independently within the community, to freedom from violence, abuse and neglect, and to access to justice. And these are just illustrative examples and are not meant in any way as a comprehensive review at all. I'm going to start with non-discrimination, as this is at the heart of the work that I'm doing at the moment on age-based employment policies in South Korea. When I was last in Seoul, I met Ji Soo-young, who at 59 was facing mandatory retirement from his job at an insurance company in 1 year's time when he was 60. And if this was not bad enough, his company had also been reducing his salary each year in the 5 years leading up to his mandatory retirement at 60, by 20% when he was 56, and then by a further 10% each year, so that by the time he was forced to retire at 60, he he was earning 40% less than he had been at 55. And to add insult to injury, the only work that was likely to be available to him when he does retire will be lower paid, more precarious, and the type of work that is undervalued and which younger people don't wish to do. Under Korean law, employers can set a mandatory retirement age of 60 or older and never need to justify it, since the law exempts retirement ages from the prohibition of age discrimination. Employers can also reduce older workers' wages based on their age in the 3 to 5 years before this mandatory retirement, in what is known as a peak wage system. The aim of the peak wage system is to use the savings from reducing older workers' salaries to hire younger workers in order to, and I quote, increase productivity, despite studies showing that older workers in South Korea are not less productive than younger ones. And I wanted to share Ji Soo-young's experience because exempting differential treatment based on age from the prohibition of discrimination, as in his mandatory retirement, and justifying this differential treatment on the basis of stereotypes based on ageism are examples of exactly what a new convention needs to address if it's going to have any practical impact. The other part of my investigation in South Korea is looking at how the accumulation of gender-based discrimination against women throughout their working lives is exacerbated by the onslaught of ageism when they reach their 40s. Our preliminary research suggests that this occurs through segregation in low-paid, physically demanding, undervalued jobs that are considered suitable only for older women, as well as age and gender-based harassment and sexual abuse at work. So again, to be of practical use, a convention should address both cumulative and intersectional discrimination, which Ken, looking back, speak. This cumulative and intersectional discrimination is particularly pertinent in older age, both because of the number of years that older people have lived through which disadvantage and marginalization can accumulate, and because older people are so diverse that ageism and age discrimination can intersect with so many other forms of discrimination in their lives. In Cape Town, in South Africa, I met Bahija, a 75-year-old woman who told me that she lived alone in a rented house in a state of complete disrepair and with no hot water since 1996. What she was scared of most was dying alone, but she also didn't want to end up in an old age home. What she wanted was the government to fund more social workers and more caregivers to visit older people like her in their own homes. And this was something that I heard about from older people I spoke to across the country. Despite promising laws to shift the emphasis away from institutional care and towards community-based services, hundreds of thousands of older people in South Africa are still unable to access the basic care and support services that they are both entitled to, and so that they can live with dignity in their own homes and in the community. Bahija spent half a century of her life under an apartheid regime, whose racial segregation policies denied many older South Africans today a decent education, decent work, and the ability to save for their older age. The cumulative impact of this racial discrimination when they were younger continues to affect older people decades on. The lack of community and home-based care and support services in South Africa negatively impacts older people's physical well-being and safety, and it may impede their dignity, autonomy, and independence, and cause profound distress of being institutionalized against their wishes. Our research in the United States showed the harm such institutionalization can do to older people, including extreme weight loss, dehydration, untreated bed sores, inadequate hygiene, and mental and physical decline. All older people are guaranteed the right to live independently within the community under international human rights law. But this guarantee is fragmented across different international human rights standards, including under the right to an adequate standard of living and the right to adequate housing under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the rights of older persons with disabilities to live independently in the community under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This fragmentation across different human rights standards has resulted in a profound protection gap. Consolidation of these fragmented rights protections in one provision on older people's right to live independently within the community in a new convention would provide clear and specific guidance to states on their obligations towards older people and clarity to older people themselves about what their rights are. The fragmentation of a right across different standards and treaties is not the only reason for the gaps in protection of people's rights. Another is where international human rights law does not address a particular right explicitly with respect to older people. And this is the case with the prohibition of violence, abuse, and neglect, including when it reaches the threshold of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Violence, abuse, and neglect against older people can take many forms. Human Rights Watch has documented the widespread use of chemical restraint in aged care facilities in Australia. Chemical restraint is the use of medications to control behavior without a therapeutic purpose or consent. It's a form of violence and abuse against older people and may amount to torture or ill treatment. Australia's existing legal and regulatory framework is inadequate to protect older people in aged care facilities from chemical restraint. Despite regulations first introduced in 2019 to minimize the use of restrictive practices, between July 2020 and June 2021, Human Rights Watch found the use of chemical restraint in more than 150 aged care facilities. Australia has recently passed a new Aged Care Act to protect the rights of users of aged care services. Not only does the Act fail to prohibit the use of chemical restraint, but it explicitly allows it. A guarantee on older people's right to live free from violence, abuse, and neglect in a new convention would provide specific and clear guidance to Australia and to other states, including that all use of chemical restraint without consent should be prohibited. As with freedom from violence, abuse, and neglect, no international human rights treaty addresses the right of access to justice explicitly with respect to older people, including in detention settings. In Japan, Human Rights Watch has documented how the current system does not cater for the needs of the increasing number of older women in prison. Guards are abusive towards older women, and cellmates bullying older women is a serious concern. Older women lack access to adequate healthcare and often have to deal with chronic pain or illness without appropriate medical treatment or advice. They're also particularly at risk at the time of release and receive little or no assistance with reintegration. To have a practical impact, a convention should include a provision on the rights of older people to access to justice, including in detention centres. That would make explicit an obligation on states to ensure that prison regimes accommodate the needs of older prisoners, including protection against violence and support with reintegration into the community. These are just some examples where the protection of older people's rights is fragmented or missing under international law as it exists at the moment. What we need is a new comprehensive convention that not only brings all the rights together in one place, but deepens our understanding of how rights apply in older age and to older people and enhances protection of these rights. Our vision at Human Rights Watch is a world in which every older person lives with dignity. Yet ageism in ourselves as individuals and in societies in which we live affects our understanding of what dignity in older age is, as being others doing things for or to or on behalf of older people in what they believe is in their best interest, denying them their autonomy and other rights. A new convention could change this understanding of dignity in older age, shifting it to one based on human rights and respect for older people's autonomy, where older people can determine their own lives, charting their own paths and making their own decisions with support if necessary, but based on what is important to them. And if a new convention could do that, then it could truly make a practical difference to everyone's lives when they're older.
I'd like to introduce Laura, who's joining us remotely. There we are. Laura. Hello. Laura Mills is a researcher at Amnesty International, and her focus is on older people and people with disabilities in armed conflict and emergency situations. And at Amnesty, she has extensively documented the situation of older people and people with disabilities during and after armed conflict, including in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Ukraine. Laura's reports are available online, and they are absolutely fascinating reading and really do give a very striking account of the situation of older people in situations of conflict. And I really recommend having a look at them. Before joining Amnesty International, Laura was a researcher at Human Rights Watch, where she worked on civil and political rights, disability rights, older persons' rights, and health across many countries. And before that, she was a foreign correspondent for the Associated Press and the Wall Street Journal, based in Moscow and in Kiev. And this evening, Laura is going to speak about the current human rights challenges facing older people in humanitarian and conflict settings, and how a convention could make a difference, drawing on her research for Amnesty International. Thank you, Laura.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Please do let me know my internet. I'm calling you all from Pakistan. We have a report coming out soon about climate disasters and older people and young children, which I'll be happy to share. It's out on May 6th, but the internet is not always reliable, so I do apologize if I suddenly cut out. Hopefully that won't happen. Thank you so much for inviting me and for the opportunity to speak about this obviously very important topic. So, you know, as you just heard, I work for a team that's called the Crisis Response Team. We primarily focus on armed conflict. We do also work on other types of humanitarian disasters, including natural disasters, earthquakes, and we also, you know, did a series of reports on COVID-19. We're really kind of like the surge capacity for the organization. So wherever there's a crisis breaking out, we can kind of help the regional teams conducting human rights research in that area. And, you know, one of our sort of big frustrations, or something that we started to notice as we visited conflict after conflict, was that older people in particular are very much neglected, both by humanitarian actors in human rights reporting about those conflicts. And, you know, it kind of feels like every time you go to a conflict, it's as if, you know, older people had just been invented, and you kind of have to sort of explain their existence to many people on the ground. So just to give a bit of background on, you know, we've worked on a number of countries, Myanmar, Northeast Nigeria, Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Most recently, we're working on Pakistan, as I mentioned. And I think it's really important to stress that for every conflict for which we have hard data, which is not that many, but at least a few, older people die at extremely disproportionate rates to their size of the population. In Ukraine, for example, at this point, people over 60 years old make up half of civilian deaths, where the age of a person was recorded. In Myanmar, Doctors Without Borders conducted a study, a survey of village elders, where they found that older people died at about 5 times the rate of other people, based on sort of data during the Rohingya massacres. In Nagorno-Karabakh, in 2020, more than half of the ethnic Armenians who were killed were over 60 years old. So we see this again and again and again. And yet it's still seen as sort of a marginalized issue and something that's not highlighted or seen as really important. So, you know, you might be asking, why are older people regularly experiencing this treatment. Partly, you know, a lot of older people do have disabilities, physical, intellectual. It makes fleeing more difficult. In Ukraine, we met a lot of older people, for example, who slept in their bathtubs during air raid sirens because they could not make it to a basement or a shelter. I spoke to a woman in Chernihiv, speaking of sort of informational accessibility. Older people don't always have a smartphone or access to social media. So when the television or the radio is down and evacuations are being announced, you know, online through various social media accounts, often older people didn't even know that they were happening. And so an older woman whose husband was in a wheelchair described seeing to me lines of people leaving the city and saying, I didn't even know this was happening. I didn't even know there was an evacuation on. Then you, of course, have situations where there simply are no evacuations. You know, the goal is to target civilians. For example, in the Rohingya massacre, there were no warnings. People were simply attacked by the military. And in those situations, again, older people are going to struggle the most to flee. They might, you know, have a disability that means they're not able to run as quickly. Even fleeing over the mountains into Bangladesh, where many sought refuge, was impossible for many older people. In Gaza, for example, where, you know, Amnesty has done a lot of work recently, mass evacuation orders are really a sort of one, and we call them evacuations in quotes because we see the goal of these evacuations is actually the forcible displacement of people in the Gaza Strip. But these mass evacuation orders come down. They give people 24 hours to leave an area. And who are the people who are not able to leave within that time frame? It's going to be older people, people with chronic health conditions, people with disabilities. And then you add to this sort of disability angle the fact that many older people do have a very strong attachment to their land and their homes. This is the only home that they know. It's often their main source of livelihood. And so by leaving those areas, for example, in Northeast Nigeria, where we covered the situation with Boko Haram, older people stayed behind because that's where their farmland was. That's the only income they had. They would not have had an income had they gone to a displacement camp. It's also important to point out, in addition to sort of the human rights abuses that they face disproportionately, that once older people are displaced, or if they are in a situation of armed conflict, they often experience more difficulty getting humanitarian aid. So for example, in the Bangladesh camps for Rohingya people, food and healthcare were often very far away from the dwellings of older people, which means that it was very difficult for them to access those things. And if, at least with food, it would be maybe like a pickup once a month or twice a month. For example, with water, which people needed every day, older people simply were left often without support, and it made them very dependent on others. And, you know, there was an assumption, which we see again and again, that older people are taken care of by family members, by someone else. It's somebody else's problem. We also found that, you know, there's a lot of discrimination that's built into humanitarian programming. So for example, in Myanmar, in displacement camps within Myanmar, livelihood programs were nearly universal in some cases, but older people were almost universally not invited to participate in them. So I'm talking about programs that would have taught someone a new type of livelihood. And of course, you know, when you ask people, are you actively discriminating against older people in these programs? They'll say no, but they, you know, the fact is that when you see again and again the same pattern, it indicates that older people are not seen as being retrainable or fit for a new kind of work in displacement. And so once they lose their employment or their land or whatever income they had, it's also, they're less likely to regain any kind of meaningful employment in displacement because of discrimination. Obviously, you know, healthcare, humanitarian emergencies really disrupt healthcare. We saw that in Ukraine, where people were cut off from pharmacies, doctors, hospitals. We have seen that in camp settings. Camps, for example, in Northeast Nigeria or malaria, they will focus almost exclusively in the healthcare needs on diseases that impact the younger population. So for example, they'll be stocked to the brim with malaria medication or medication to deal with waterborne diseases, but they will not have any diabetes or hypertension medication. This is something that we also see in detention settings, where, for example, in Northeast Nigeria, where the military arbitrarily detained many older people received basically no health care, unlike some younger groups. And the military it barred families from bringing them specific, so for example, diabetes medication, or for example, special food for those who have diabetes. So for emergencies generally disrupt healthcare delivery, and I'm seeing that even in Pakistan, where we have a report that's coming out on May 6th about the climate emergency and climate disasters. And for example, I interviewed a woman, Akil Nad, who had diabetes, and as a result of not having access to healthcare for 3 months, had to have her leg amputated. And these are sort of totally invisible. We don't see them as casualties in a war. The people who sort of lose their legs or have that stroke because they don't have access to medication, they will not be listed anywhere as casualties. But they are the result of a sort of disrupted system. And that needs to be taken into account in humanitarian responses. And then finally, sort of speaking of the climate crisis, I mean, that is really the looming humanitarian challenge of our era. And in Pakistan, where we're working, we have found not only that older people are obviously very much at risk during floods because of mosquito and waterborne diseases, or during heat waves, but there's simply no protection for them. So for example, older people are forced to work in 50-degree Celsius heat, doing physical labor, whether that's guarding a petrol station or, carrying goods from the Karachi port. These are all people we've actually interviewed, because they don't have social protection, because only 20% of the country has any kind of pension. So for most people, the option is you starve or you work in very dangerous conditions that could kill you. So, and then just to add one additional element to that, there's a total invisibility of older people in data collection. So in Pakistan, one of the things that we found was that essentially health data and mortality data on people over 50 does not exist. Very sadly, that one of the few tools that did exist that really sort of comprehensively captured health data in Pakistan, although not including older people, was the Demographic Health Survey that was funded by USAID, which has now been terminated by the Trump administration. So even the data that existed, while inadequate and exclusionary, deliberately exclusionary of older people, there was an explicit cutoff of people over 50 years old. Even the data that existed is going to go away. And so basically we're entering an era of climate crises that disproportionately impact older people, and yet we're sort of making ourselves blind to what's actually happening to them. And we're sort of not collecting that data in many places. And, I think it's just to reiterate my earlier point, older people are everywhere. Even a country like Pakistan, I'm being told again and again in advocacy meetings I'm doing this week, oh, I'd never thought about older people and climate change. And yes, it's a relatively young country. Young people make up 50% of the population and older people make up 7%. But that is about to double in the next 2 decades, right? People are getting older everywhere, and much of the world seems totally ill-equipped to deal with it. So, just to reiterate the points that have been made here, I mean, Amnesty International also very strongly supports the convention. Older people are protected by humanitarian law already. They're specifically mentioned. The words used are the elderly and the infirm, which obviously we don't like, but it was written in 1949 in the 4th Geneva Convention, which protects civilians. They're generally protected as civilians under IHL. But what we have seen again and again is that this is not enough to protect older people. Even in mainstream human rights reporting on armed conflict, for example, UN-mandated reporting missions, they don't mention older people at all very often. Older people are completely overlooked. And, I do think that a convention would fundamentally alter that dynamic. It would raise the profile of older people and ensure not only that we have a better understanding of what protections are needed for their rights, but that is then integrated and filters out across the human rights system. And we can kind of take an example here from the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Article 11 on the convention in the CRPD explicitly refers to people with disabilities in situations of armed conflict and humanitarian emergencies. And it has created a whole body of general comments, UN Security Council resolutions. It informs all humanitarian policy. I mean, even my own country, the United States, which never ratifies any human rights instruments, when we used to talk to people at State Department or at USAID, the CRPD informed everything they did. It was the gold standard. And not having that for older people has led to complete invisibility, a lack of standards. And again, we have to reinvent the wheel every time we go to a new conflict, every time we explore a new set of human rights violations. And so, yeah, that's why I think it's obviously well overdue. And I very much hope that the meaningful progress that was made this year by so many groups representing older people comes to fruition sooner rather than later, because I really feel like how many more conflicts, how many more humanitarian disasters can we go through witnessing the invisibility and the exclusion of older people? It's really, it's been enough. But thank you so much all for your time, and very much looking forward to a discussion. Thank you.
Very much, Laura. But now I'd like to introduce Professor John Williams as our fourth speaker this evening. Professor John Williams is a emeritus professor of law at Aberystwyth University, and he is also chair of Age Cymru. And he has had a long and distinguished career at Aberystwyth University between 1975 and 2018, primarily researching into the human rights of older people. And during his career, Professor Williams focused on the impact of the law in terms of older people accessing health and social care. And he also undertook extensive research on older prisoners, the design of care homes, international law and aging, and domestic abuse and older people. He has also advised the National Assembly for Wales on the drafting of the Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Act. And he was a member of the United Nations expert group meeting on human rights of older people. I could go on, but I won't. But you bring a tremendous amount of experience and expertise, John, and thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Bethan, for your introduction. I must admit I've learned so much from our speakers this evening, and it's an excellent event. I think also it's appropriate that I express my personal thanks to Ken and his many colleagues for the hard work that they have undertaken since 2010 in finally getting agreement to go ahead with an international convention. I suspect at times it was like pulling teeth, but your perseverance and the compelling case that you made throughout the open-ended working group have clearly led to a very desirable conclusion. Although, as you say, Ken, the work is just beginning. There's a lot to do. At the outset, just three general points I'd like to make. One is, I think, a convention requires us to, and perhaps provides the opportunity to reframe the debate on aging. As an older person, I am sick and tired of hearing about the demographic time bomb, about the problem of an aging population. The fact that I've lived 25 years longer than my father, I find cause for celebration rather than anything else. And I think we should welcome and rejoice in the fact that we are living longer. It is not a problem, it's a challenge. It is also an opportunity because in disaster relief, in crisis, older people have much to contribute. In the UK, for example, I think over 1/3 of childcare is provided by, guess who? Grandparents, for nothing. The second point is about international law. When I started out as an academic, my first course I taught was international law, and perhaps demonstrating a lack of confidence in my early days, the first seminar question was, is international law law? I suspect if the conclusion most students was no, they felt they could walk away from the course. International law is different. It is still law. It impacts, as we've heard, nation states in many different ways. In some cases, it is readily enforceable. On Saturday, I'm flying to Chicago. I thank goodness that there's an international convention on civil aviation that's some 80 years old, in fact, that will ensure that my airspace is not shared with any other plane. So it works. And I think we've got to be aware of those who come and say, well, it's all fluff. It's not, it works. The third thing is, we in the UK must not consider this is a convention for other nations. It's also a convention for us. We know in the UK, pensioner poverty is a real thing, or housing, fuel poverty. We know that abuse and neglect are prevalent. And the outcome of the convention will be good for older people in the UK. Oh, now which button do I press? I wonder. Oh, there. Press that one there. Okay,
No, the other one.
no, oh, sorry, Ken. Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, thank you, Ken. I have prepared some slides. I won't go through them all because that I things a little bit, but you can have the slides after the event. I always think it's useful to start any discussion on human rights with Eleanor Roosevelt's quote. Eleanor Roosevelt, former First Lady of America, played a central role in getting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights agreed. And she said, I won't read the whole quote, but those very important words, where, after all, do universal rights begin? In small places close to home. And that struck me because I remember visiting Kenya on a Help Age International visit. And we visited a small village. And there was a grandmother looking after her grandchildren, 3 of them. Their parent had died as a result of AIDS, HIV. She was also looking after a sick home. And she lived in, yes, a very primitive home. She was happy to see us. She talked to us. And human rights have to mean something for her. Yes, we have to relate it to people living in those conditions as well as ourselves. They represent, human rights represent not just abstract concepts. They represent the real experience that must be enjoyed in every village, neighborhood, care home, workplace, or community. But for older people, sadly, these rights are often aspirational. They are not a reality. They don't happen. Today, we're discussing the urgent need for a global convention to protect and to promote the human rights of older persons. And despite the many advances, and we've heard of some of them this evening, in the international human rights framework, older persons still face significant challenges to ageism, discrimination, abuse, neglect, rendered very often invisible. It's not helped by the language of the conventions that we have in place, we've already heard. They rarely, if ever, mention older persons. Older persons come into the category all other status, or all, everyone. Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is one exception. It guarantees everyone the right to a standard of living adequate for their health and well-being, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and social services. And it makes the only reference in the declaration to old age. So older people are left to be implicitly included under those very vague terms or under status. And this has contributed, I think, to a failure to address the unique challenges faced by older people across the globe. The European Convention on Human Rights, well, you could say, yeah, that's pretty good. Incorporated it into our own law. And we know that Article 14 prohibits discrimination. Age has only received limited attention from the European Court of Human Rights. We saw that in the British Gurkha case. We've seen that actually in the recent case involving Switzerland and the climate change protesters who were all women. And there's a rather frightening of the European Court. Basically, women were saying we have a legitimate interest in the case before the European Court of Human Rights because we have an interest in the climate. The court dismissed that application and questioned whether the applicants, who were women, quote, who were women already over the age of 80. Yes, already over the, would themselves, whether they would be individually affected by the effects invoked from global warming, which 1.5 centigrade in 2040. Women in the 80s, but if they didn't, they have a vested interest in the slow worsening or fast worsening of the climate. And that, to my mind, shows a rather different approach to age. One on other grounds, namely organization that they belong to. Socio-economic rights are also a significant component. Again, we've heard a lot from Bridget and Laura and Ken on this. Yeah, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And these rights encompass social security, adequate living conditions, pensions, the highest attainable physical and mental health standards. They're crucial in alleviating poverty, addressing poor living conditions, reducing isolation among older people, and promoting their dignity, independence, and well-being. We're not terribly good implementing socio-economic human rights. We tend to think they're a bit of a bolt-on goodie. Much of that. The European Convention on Human Rights, its primary focus is on civil and political rights, and fair dues to the European Court. It has made some inroads into acknowledging socio-economic rights. But that's not enough. It's clear that the ESE, is the European Convention on Human Rights, is unable to do the heavy lifting that's required in ensuring that socio-economic rights are enjoyed by older people. Following on from the Universal Declaration, of course, we have a number of other conventions, and again, we mentioned Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, very important. Convention on the Rights of the Child, important. People are very often carers. Kinship caring is on the increase. So again, that convention is important. Discrimination against women and protection of migrant workers and families. This kind of fragmentation of human rights or specialization challenges the Universal Declaration, which relies very much on universality, everybody, all. Yes, the UDHR did create a cohesive normative framework, But the rise of overlapping and specialized conventions, such as the CRPD, required the international community to concentrate more on how human rights can be made to work in particular groups. It ensures that these groups are not ignored in the human rights discourse. Of course, the missing piece in that jigsaw are older people. This is what the convention aims to put right. And intersectionality is important. How would the new convention fit in with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and other conventions? How is it going to work? We have a lot of soft law in the international community. The Vienna Plan on Aging, the International Plan on Aging, the Madrid International Plan, the UN Principle on Older Persons. Useful, but soft law, not enforced. And given the option, many states would not enforce them if they don't have to. The open-ended working group, I think, was a major success, the major initiative by the UN, and it's good to see that it is actually producing results. So we have a human rights deficit for older people. And what's it look like in practice? We've heard some examples. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 6 people aged over 60 experience abuse in community settings. In working homes, 2 in 3 staff admitted abusing residents. Older persons, as we've heard, face challenges in accessing healthcare, employment and social care programs and pensions. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, grandparents care for grandchildren orphaned by AIDS and facing physical, mental and financial strain. And older women are at particular risk of abandonment, property confiscation, and the use of rape as a weapon of war. The lack of data, we've heard about it. Disaggregated data is important. We don't want data that says 60 and over. We want data that sort of many different age groups within those people over 60 years of age. It could be a 50-year span, and people are different. So while initiatives like the UN principles and the Madrid International Plan on Aging are okay, show willingness to discuss older people, they depict older people more as recipients of protection rather than rights holders. And that was a major success, I think, of the CRPD, that we looked at people with disabilities as holders of rights, not someone to be. I was asked just to say a few words on Wales. There may be things we can learn from Wales. One, we have an Older People's Commission. And I think any convention should include a provision on Older People's Commissioner, because the Older People's Commissioner can challenge government and make sure that what government says it's going to do, it actually does. Public authorities in social care are required to have due regard to the UN principles. And very importantly, in Wales, and indeed in Scotland, certain public bodies must address socio-economic inequalities and engage with disadvantaged communities, the requirement in the Equality Act 2010. It's good to see the Westminster government is currently considering implementing that duty in England 15 years down the line. So what would the Older People's Convention do? Well, firstly, explicitly recognize older people as holders of rights, not objects of pity. Combat ageism and discrimination on a global scale. Ensure access to healthcare, social security, and equitable employment opportunities. Promote dignity, independence, and involvement for older persons. Address the implementation gaps. And very importantly, monitor effectively, collect disaggregated data. The convention would protect older people and challenge systems and practices that impinge upon their rights. that will provide enforceable standards moving beyond the limitations of the soft law we have at the moment. So in closing, let's remember that aging, and sadly ageism, is a universal experience. The rights we advocate for today are the rights we will rely on tomorrow. Older persons are not a separate group. They are our parents, our grandparents, our neighbours, and eventually they are ourselves. Their rights are human rights, and their dignity is our collective responsibility. So let's take the challenge. Let's work together to bring aging out of the shadows and into the light of justice, equality, and conclusion. The Global Convention on Older Persons' Human Rights is not just necessary, it is imperative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for that very inspiring contribution. Really grateful. Right, we now have an opportunity to ask questions to our speakers in the remaining 10 minutes or so. So if anybody'd like to ask a question or make a contribution of your own, a comment that you'd like to make, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for a really interesting discussion. So one question I'm curious about is how an older person is going to be defined. Because I understand that the member states will, it won't be the same for all member states, but if you have any views on that, that would be really interesting. And just one other point is about, which again may apply to some member states more than others, is the use of AI in social care. And I don't know if much thought has been given to it in the context of the convention, but if you have any views on that, that would also be very interesting. I'm thinking particularly in terms of older people having less contact with other human beings and their privacy. So yeah, if I can just.
I think, I mean, definitions plagued the Children's Convention. This childhood begin or when does it end? And I don't think, one, we should get too hung up about it. I think we can take a fairly pragmatic view, but clearly, if we say it's 60, in some countries, span is 50. So it doesn't make much sense. So I think there has to be a kind of sensitivity there. At the moment, I think the UN takes it fairly pragmatic. It's say round about 50, but it depends on why you're asking the question. If you look at prisoners, they age 10 years faster. So it's more sense to say the age of 50. So I guess, others may have views on this. I guess we're looking at some vague statement around 60, but a recognition of national life expectancy, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense. One thing I hope we don't get into is a 10-year debate on what an older person is, because that's not going to help us at all. As I say, it was an issue that could have derailed the Children's Convention quite easily, particularly, I think, young people serving in the armed forces. On AI, I think it is a problem. I think that provides opportunities. But my fear is that it's going to be seen as we're seeing signs of that already, and we're seeing packages develop that allegedly make sense of an assessment a social worker has undertaken. It does deny people human contact. Neighbour had one of the old-fashioned home helps. I doubt the home help ever did any cleaning. The house was far from pristine. But boy, a cup of coffee, a cigarette, a chat. That was brilliant. That was care in the community. So there's a role to play. Let's be careful.
Yeah, just pick up on that. I mean, I think it is a challenging, you rightly picked up on one of the things in terms of the definition that is going to be challenging. And it's part of the challenge that we face is the fact that we haven't started the process of really discussing these things because we've only just agreed, or member states have only just agreed to start the process of drafting. So, but over the last decade and a half, consensus does seem to be building that actually we need to not be thinking about definitions in terms of a chronological age model. Partly because actually that could potentially undermine the sovereignty of national legislation in different countries, because a lot of what we fix a specific age to is a person's entitlements and what they receive and the benefits they get. And so that definition should be nationally owned as to how a government is going to provide those entitlements. But partly because actually what we're talking about is one's experience in society, and culturally defined norms and social norms are the things that really determine one's experience of being older, for the better and for the worse. And so we don't have the definition yet, but if I had to look into my crystal ball, I would suggest that we probably will try to shy away from a fixed age range. But look, I've been wrong before. And in terms of AI, I mean, I think one of the opportunities that we have of creating this human rights convention is that we're doing it in the context of experiences which were never put before human rights legislators. So I think there's going to be a lot of interest in terms of how much can be put into this convention actually that we haven't been able to tackle in other things. That's an opportunity as well as a challenge, because we may find different stakeholders wanting to say, well, let's use this Convention on the Rights of Older Persons as a way of solving this problem over there. Fundamentally, it has to be future leaning. It has to be something that allows not just AI, but access to technology in general to be addressed. So I think perhaps it'd be less specific about one particular technology. It may be defined a little bit more broadly as making sure that older people are not discriminated against and excluded from society on the basis of technology. Naturally.
Just go next.
Thanks a lot, everyone. That's really interesting. I'm an immigration practitioner, so my question is kind of with that framing, and I'll explain why, but I'm interested in your view on the role of families and the way in which the right to family life has been interpreted over time will probably and can be drawn on in the drafting process, but also what limitations that has. Because one of the things that we see when we make immigration applications for family members that have additional needs that could be as a result of age, it could be as a result of disability or health needs, or a combination of those, is that we have to show dependence. And that's one of the ways in which, you know, an application could succeed if there is dependence and various other factors. But I guess where I'm going with this is that there is, I guess, exactly what you were just saying around the sort of, there's an opportunity, but there's a real risks that because we're a long way down the road with interpretation of different human rights, there's also already a lot of restrictions and limitations that are potentially going to be inherited into this new framework. And I think what we're seeing, especially around the right to family life in an immigration context in the UK, is that it's being more and more restricted. And so I'm really curious, like how this can be a way to open up existing rights and be much more inclusive, and how to kind of bring that into the drafting process as something that really means that anything going forward isn't just aspirational, but is very practical, which is what all of you have spoken to, and how we see that not just at an international level, but also domestically and really very concretely in different legal processes. You know, that goes obviously far beyond immigration.
Thank you. So not just aspirational, but practical, so that it's actually going to make a difference. and this is sort of a question about the drafting. And I'm sure we're all thinking about this process of drafting, which is going to happen next, and are looking for insights into it. It may be that this is another one for you, Ken.
Or Bridget, maybe.
Bridget, is this one for you? Great.
Okay.
Yeah, please do.
I haven't worked in that area, so I can't speak specifically, but I think one of the things that we must avoid or try to avoid is perpetuating those inherited restrictions. And I think that the way to do that is to have people with the expertise or with the lived experience being part of the drafting process, the negotiating process, or at least being able to influence and contribute to it in some way. Certainly those of us who work on older people's rights won't have all of that experience. And so we need people who are working in immigration or in other fields where there are these restrictions to join and to be part of the process. So I think that that would be the way to ensure that, because I'm sure there are in many other areas as well, there are dangers lurking there that we want to avoid, as you say, inheriting. And while I'm speaking, can I just go back to the last question on definitions, because I think that it is something that people have discussed or have used as a way to try and derail the process, saying if you can't even define an older person, how can you possibly have a convention protecting their rights? And I think that asking how do we define an older person is probably the wrong question, but rather it's around what's the purpose of a new convention and what do we want to see it achieve, and therefore who should it apply to. And so in terms of using a chronological age definition, that will not enable the convention to provide protection to everyone whose rights are being denied because of their older age or perceptions of their older age. So, for example, the women that I've been interviewing in their 40s in South Korea are being subjected to ageism and age discrimination because of their older age. And yet, if you had a chronological age definition of 60 or 65 or 72 or whatever the arbitrary number might be, you would exclude people who the convention is there to protect. And so I think it's something that we're going to have to deal with. And one way around a specific definition would be to have a purpose clause that looks at the purpose of the convention and who it should apply to. And that would not be chronologically defined, but in terms of what the type of violations of rights that the convention is there to protect against, and people who experience those. So sorry to go back to that.
No.
I just ask a follow on that with regards to I mean, you were saying about the importance the people are involved in thinking about what the elements should be of the convention, and in the drafting process, is that going to be open so that people can see what's happening and understand what the issues are, and will the process have some sort of public visibility, or is it going to be a little bit sort of shrouded in mystery, and we'll just find out at the end of what came out of it?
Well, hopefully the former, hopefully not shrouded in mystery. We don't know yet. And so the resolution that was adopted earlier this month set up an organizational meeting, as Ken was talking about, and it will be at that point that the modalities, as they call them, of the process will be discussed and decided on. In civil society, we are pushing for the widest possible participation from civil society and from older people themselves and their representative organizations. There is resistance within some states of the UN of having such wide participation. So we don't know yet, but even if we, which we hope won't happen, even if we're not able to sit at the table, there are other ways that we can influence the states who are sitting at that table. So obviously we want direct, meaningful participation, but if not that we would be influencing in other ways.
If I could just, sorry, just add to that and also come back to the immigration question. So, I mean, I think that one of the reasons why it's so important that this decision was made within the Human Rights Council is because there is a way of working within the Human Rights Council that does acknowledge and recognize the role of civil society and people affected by the human rights. So I think it's true, it's that we don't know what the actual mechanisms are going to be, but I think we can be fairly optimistic that there will be a role for civil society and for older persons at the table. I just want to go back to the point about kind of how the practical side of things and that example about putting immigration law into practice. And I think it's important to remember that this is not going to be a document that's going to allow for every possible contingency. So you're not going to see everything that you would want to see and clearly identified. It has to be a minimum set of standards, but guidance and clarity. But the one thing that I think it will do is it will challenge us as well as help us. So in the case of applying the right to family life and being able to allow an older person to stay a part of their family by showing dependence, well, what's crucial is that actually we do not, what a convention will force us to do is not to think about dependence as an inherent characteristic. So just by virtue of a person's age, that does not mean that they are dependent. So there will be a burden of proof that's necessary that requires us to demonstrate actually that there is a genuine dependence relationship there. Now that may make your job more harder as a solicitor, but on the other hand, it's also protecting and safeguarding a person's dignity and autonomy.
There's some interesting work in America on the definition of family law, which traditionally is husband, wife, partner, civil. And this is saying, well, no, forget all that, because the dynamics are far different now than they were when we came up with all this stuff. And they include older people. And it's about mainstreaming them into family law, which I think is quite an interesting concept. And I think the general point, and that builds on what Bridget said, I don't think the convention should be a prisoner of the status quo. I think it's got to be quite brave and say, no, actually, that's not acceptable. I think on consultation, our commissioner did quite an interesting exercise a few years ago. It's about human rights of people in care homes. And I was working with a colleague from the commissioner's office, and we talked to older people. It's interesting. We all think of human rights like private life, dignity, very important. It's not how they see it. It's not the language they use. And if we're talking about human rights, we've got to use their language. Their language is, I don't want to be put on the commode in the middle of a crowded room. I want people to knock on my door before I come in. It's coming from that, I think. And we can put the legalese onto it later on, but it's the actual issues that older people face and that worry them, which they won't express in terms of, it's my article, it's right. They won't. Why would they? And so I think the way we talk to and involve older people in the convention is going to be very important.
I work in Parliament on human rights, international human rights, particularly on political and civil rights, but I have two questions. So why do you think the UK government is not more supportive of this? You know, they say that they are in principle, but they haven't made this a big political issue in Parliament so far anyway. I've got some ideas myself of why. Cost implications comes to mind. Anything that has cost implications at the moment is not a popular thing. Also, I think there's intergenerational conflict as well. which I think we have to recognize in this country. A lot of younger voters are saying that older people in the UK have benefited much more from the post-war economic boom, so to speak, you know, housing ladder, they've got property, they have good pensions. So why should we really focus on older people who in their eyes are seen as more privileged? And I think that it makes it much less politically palatable to actually, you know, for the government to take this on. So there's that. And then in terms of civil and political rights, I'm thinking a lot of this has revolved around economic and social rights, but I'm thinking in terms of, you know, older people being able to vote, for example. This comes up time and again. You know, I cannot leave my care home setting. I'm not able to get to polling booth. So how, you know, there are a number of political rights that I think a convention could deal with as well. And you could maybe expand on that. That would be helpful.
I'll take the first bit of that and then hand over to colleagues for the second. Look, there's I don't think that actually the lack of this government, and actually it's really important that we use that article, this government, because it's been successive governments that have been engaging with this issue over the years. I think it just hasn't hit their political radar yet. So it's less of a question of opposition to it and much more a question of, do we have to answer that question right now? Or not even feeling like maybe they've been asked, which is why we've been pushing hard on the campaigning side and not hard enough, to be honest. And so we need to push a little bit harder. There is always reticence, I think, amongst, and one of the objections, there have been many objections over the years, and actually to every single human rights convention that's been put on the table, there's been a series of not objections, but concerns expressed. So can we use existing mechanisms that in rights better? How much is this going to cost? Can the system handle yet another human rights convention? All of those arguments have been clearly been put to one side. They've been acknowledged. They've recognized that they don't stand to scrutiny. So I think there is undoubtedly going to be a bit of reticence, perhaps within certain government departments, about the potential future cost that can happen. But in balance, the UK government has always been a very forward-leaning government and country in terms of human rights, in terms of a foreign policy agenda, in terms of the position it wants to hold in the world. And the final bit, just in terms of kind of why maybe this hasn't landed yet, is that there is no single department that has responsibility for aging and older people. And so where you've got that dispersed set of responsibilities, it means it's harder to corral the troops internally. And like I said, I just don't think this has really landed as a high priority yet politically in terms of decisions the government has to make.
Thank you. Yeah, would anybody like to come back on any of those other points? If not, it may be that, okay, it may be that we'll just take one more question because we have gone slightly over time, but it starts slightly late. So if there's one more question.
I could very quickly, with very top line answer to the civil and political ones. Absolutely. I think the convention needs to address all areas of rights, and traditionally, I think aging and older people's issues have been confined to not only to sort of a welfare-based approach, but also to economic and social policy. So yes, you mentioned the right to vote, so participation in decision-making. The areas we've talked about, access to justice, equal participation in public life, and older people's ability or enjoyment of these rights will vary from context to context, but absolutely it needs to be a sort of a comprehensive treaty that looks at these rights interdependently.
I fully put the generational point, and I think many in the media and indeed some politicians have made a lot of mischief about intergenerational divides. I don't believe that it's as bad as people portray. And to me, older and younger people share many of the problems around poverty, about housing, about health, access to health care, about access to social care. They have much more in common. And the media do a disservice when they talk about gold-plated pensions and all the other stuff, because that's very few. That's very few. Look at the figures of fuel poverty in the United Kingdom. It's disturbing, very disturbing. So I think it's the African protocol, Ken, on the rights of older people that talks about intergenerationality. And maybe that is something that needs to be built into the convention, the importance of finding common cause with the younger generation and working with them. It's back maybe to the definition of old, what the convention is trying to achieve. But my experience of working with them is that they love their grandparents by and large.
Okay, so we'll just have the last thing. Thank you very much. Just have the last question.
My question is for Ken specifically. You said that you decided that no specific UN body would be needed and that the convention would cover things. So I just wanted to ask how that decision was made, and also which bodies do you see having specific responsibilities and obligations?
So I just sorry to misrepresented that. It's not that this decision has been made, but it's so first of all, we have, this is uncharted territory. So until we have a human rights convention on the rights of older persons, we would be very difficult to anticipate how the UN is going to react and respond to that. I would venture a guess that given the current state of affairs and the way that UN system is grappling with its own current multilateralism, with the reduction of budgets that are happening, that there's going to be very little appetite for setting up something like this. I think it's less about an agency that has responsibility. It's much more about the accountability mechanisms and the treaty body mechanism. So how is the UN going to monitor the application and its own responsibilities around this in member states? And that's, we don't know yet what that would actually look like. We will be arguing quite forcefully that there is robust accountability and review mechanisms that are built into this that requires governments to report against how they're doing, like there are for other treaty bodies. And so that will create a small structure within the human rights system, but not necessarily a UN Women or a UNSF, which is more of a fundraising and a program-oriented UN agency.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll have to draw close there because we've gone over time. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to ask you any questions, Laura, which is a terrible shame because I had lots of questions I wanted to ask you. So I hope we meet again sometime. And before we all disperse, I just wanted to ask you, Laura, again, if you could just remind us about the report that you said was coming out on May the 6th and what the name of that is and where it will be accessible.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks everyone. The report is it's called Uncounted: The Invisible Deaths of Older People and Children During Climate Disasters in Pakistan, and it'll be out on May 6th. I'm happy to share it with you, Bethan, and then you know, it's going to be on Amnesty's website. We'll be doing a lot of press and videos and all sorts of things about it. So happy to share that.
Great, thank you very much for that. If you enjoyed this event, please do visit our YouTube channel where you will see videos of previous events of all sorts. I'm sure there will be something of interest to you, whether it's to do with human rights or another area of law that you may practice in. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you so much.